Clumsy Beauty and Her Aunts by Patrick Kennedy, Part 3. The wedding took place a few days later, and it was exceedingly grand. Ursula's mother was there along with the rest, and at the wedding dinner the Queen could talk of nothing but the lovely shirts and how happy she and the bride would be after the honeymoon, when they would be spinning and weaving and sewing shirts without end. The bridegroom didn't much like the conversation, and the bride liked it less. But before either could interject, a footman came up to the head of the table and said to the bride, "Your ladyship's aunt, Coila Cushmore, bade me ask if she might come in." The bride blushed and wished she were 7 miles under the floor, but she nodded, and the prince said, "Tell Mrs. Cushmore that any relation of my bride's will always be heartily welcome wherever she and I are." In came the woman with the big foot, and she got a rear seat near the Queen. But the Queen, who didn't like interruption, soon asked rather spitefully, "Dear madam, what's the reason your foot is so big?" "Faith, your majesty," said Cushmore, "I was standing almost all my life at the spinning wheel, and that's the reason." "I declare to you, my darling," said the prince, horrified, "I'll never allow you to spend 1 hour at the same spinning wheel." A little while later the footman approached again and said, "Your ladyship's aunt, Kuliak Cromanamore, wishes to come in, if you have no objection." The prince said, and Ursula said she was welcome, and she took her seat and drank healths aplenty to the company. But after a minute the Queen said, "May I ask, madam, why you're so wide halfway between the head and the feet?" "That, your majesty, is owing to sitting all my life at the loom," said Cromanamore. "By my scepter," said the prince, "my wife shall never sit there an hour." Finally the footman approached again and said, "Your ladyship's aunt, Shronmara, is asking leave to come into the banquet." Again the bride and bridegroom said she was welcome, and in came the old woman and settled herself at the table. "Madam," said the Queen, "will you tell us, if you please, why your nose is so big and red?" "Troth, your majesty, my head was bent down over stitching all my life, and all the blood in my body ran into my nose," said Shronmara. "My darling," said the prince, in all seriousness to Ursula, "if I ever see a needle in your hand, I'll run 100 miles from you." And in this way the clumsy Ursula was relieved of spinning work for the rest of her life, and she and the prince were happily married at last. And that's the story of the Clumsy Beauty and Her Aunts by Patrick Kennedy.